Welcome to the Sankaset podcast. I'm your host, Amie Watson. I was really excited to be drinking wine with Kaitlin Doucette today, who you might know as the wine director for the Olive and Gourmando group, which includes the cafe and bakery in the Old Port in Montreal, as well as Foxy Restaurant in Griffintown and the Italian aperitivo spot Cafe Un Po di Più, also in the Old Port. But then she texted me this afternoon and said, "Can I drink a beer?" And what am I going to say? No, of course not. She can drink whatever she'd like. And then she thought maybe she'd bring some sake, some sherry. I'm thinking sake because I had a big order of sake come in lately, which we'll do on another podcast for sure. But I'm excited to drink anything with this woman. She still knows way more about wine than I probably ever will. And she's very versatile as well. We're going to talk about the Montreal Restaurant Workers Relief Fund, which she's a co-founder of, and we're going to talk about her history within wine and outside of wine, as well as what she's doing lately, our classic lightning round. I think I can say classic now because this is podcast number 3, and I think it's going to be a great time. I am going to drink some wine. She is going to drink whatever she wants to drink, and we'll hopefully have a great time. Kaitlin, I need to say thank you for joining me today. I know you're out of town right now, and I know that it's a happy hour, and you said you haven't been drinking so much during this COVID-19, so I appreciate you having a drink with me today. You are a wine consultant for businesses. You're also the wine director of the Olive and Gourmando group, and I don't think you are drinking a wine today. So I would love to hear what you are drinking.
Yeah, so I'm drinking this really lovely beer. It's the Hypa IPA from a small microbrewery out here. I don't know if you can see that, called Brasserie Budge Canada. And they're a very, very small brewery operating here. I'm just north of Ottawa in the Gatineau Hills, so I'm in Chelsea. They're a brewery in Gatineau, and they started just over a year ago. Maybe they're about 2 years old. They make a really progressive IPAs, and they're getting really well known for the style. So part of the little benefit of me coming home was turns out I reconnected with all kinds of friends through this, and one of my very good old friends is the brewer there. So he sent me a little mix pack of samples. So it's my first time trying this one. It's kind of their flagship beer. And they make really interesting New England style IPA. So dry hop, very hazy, but also a little bit less bitter than a traditional IPA. So a little more fruity, almost kind of like exotic tropical fruit notes. So it goes down really easy and it's very smooth. It's kind of a warm day here today. So I wanted something bitter and refreshing.
I love how you talk about that. You really describe it like someone who's used to talking about wine or talking about alcohol and describing it.
I feel rusty, but
I feel like you would do a better job describing this than I will.
Oh, so great.
You know that one?
Yeah, so that's that's an excellent choice for this time of day. I wish I had that.
I wish I could share it with you.
I'm from Pascal Potter. He's in the Loire. He's really well known for being kind of an expert on the pétillant naturel style. So as you can hear, you just open it up. Yeah. And a lot of pet nats tend to lose their bubble, but look at that. It's really persistent. So he's very, very well known for that. And I think that one's he usually changes the blend a little bit. It's always like Gamay, Groslo, Cab Franc. There's lots of different styles with a little bit of residual sugar sometimes, but very
there's a touch on it. Yeah.
It's
like a nice touch. It's very fruity. It's very, very fresh, and yeah, it smells like summer. It smells like just raspberries to me. It's just red fruit, really bright.
It's a great choice for this time of the afternoon or early evening.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to talk about your new job, essentially, because right now you're obviously not working in the restaurant or any of the restaurants or as a wine consultant, I imagine. But what you're best known for at the moment probably is your work as the co-founder of the Montreal Restaurant Workers Relief Fund. So that must be a pretty dramatic job change for you. And for anybody who doesn't know, it's a fund that stepped in with $50, $100, and $150 checks to restaurant workers who suddenly found themselves facing tough choices between things like buying groceries, filling prescriptions, paying rent, very like basic necessities of life. And that was before the government offered any kind of assistance. So I'm wondering how the fund is doing now. I saw that it's raised more than $89,000, which is incredible. Can you give us an update? What's going on? Do people still need these checks?
So we've been it's really amazing. We've been very well embraced by the restaurant community. We've actually raised over $100,000, which is really great.
Wow.
So GoFundMe doesn't report all of our income, because during this process, we became a nonprofit. So now we have our independent bank account as well.
Okay.
So we have some money in the bank there. You can always see the total on our public fund tracker, which is really great. We've seen some ebbs and flows in applicants, but I'm really curious to see. We're very much dedicated to sticking in this in the long haul. So I'm very curious to see, as this crisis evolves, what kind of further precarity we'll see for this sector. I'm anticipating it being quite a lot, so we'd love to be there as a resource for people to help them through.
Okay. Well, congratulations. Cheers.
Thank
to
you.
that.
Cheers.
Digital
Yeah.
cheers. How do you feel about digital cheers?
I don't know. It's great. It's nice. At least it's one way to feel connected, you know? It's like a very familiar and comforting gesture.
I feel like I need to add the sound to it. Like I'll go to my audio engineer, Max Singer, and be like, can you enhance the popping sound of the wine? Can you add a little clink there for me? That would be wonderful.
I love that.
Yeah. Well, so tell me then, are you still getting applicants? Like you've hit an enormous amount of money. Are you just having trouble getting that out to people? Is that amount actually needed by restaurant workers in Montreal?
So we're finding that depending on also how EI checks roll in, at the beginning when we opened things up, it was a huge amount of demand and we were kind of overwhelmed with the demand at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
So we're continuing this on a rolling basis. We're finding it less overwhelming now, but still very consistent. And as I mentioned, I think there's a big misconception, and we're trying to push the message out that even if you had EI, even if you had government aid, you can still apply and be accepted. It's not a prerequisite that you're not on anything or anything like that.
Yeah.
So it's very much accessible to everyone. And we started doing some outreach to owners and things like that to spread the message, to let them know that we are there as a resource.
Are there people using this fund that aren't eligible for EI? Are there other reasons that people will access it, or in addition to EI?
The one thing that we do make in our mandate as a kind of consistency is that we do accept undocumented workers, which a lot of the funds that are similar that are going around do not make provisions for. So we found it to be very useful, particularly for that sector who has absolutely no recourse for wage security right now or any kind of government aid. Yeah. But I mean, generally speaking, like the response has been super positive. Folks are writing us these lovely thank you notes. So it definitely shows me that there's still a need out there for these kinds of resources for restaurant people.
Okay, great. And so tell me about your day then, because obviously what you were doing before is a little bit different than this.
Yeah.
What was your average day like before? And just walk me through what your average day is now.
Yeah, before the day was very variable, but very often I would go into work at around, start my day off, maybe go for a workout, or I often go to the pool, which is what I'm really missing. I'm finding in this COVID crisis, I'm missing my swim, and then do that in the morning, and then get to work around noon, anywhere between noon and 2, and then usually have a little lineup of tastings. So doing consultancies with wine reps, choosing wines for the various restaurants out of their portfolios, strategizing the wine programs for the next X amount of time, and then doing some very boring, non-glamorous part of the sommelier work, which is like inventory and spending a lot of time in basements and counting dusty bottles and things like that. So my day is wrapped, and then service, of course, the service aspect of it. Yeah. So a full service in the restaurant. I was at Foxy on the floor, the sommelier on the floor. So that was a big chunk of my job. Now totally changed, none of that. Still definitely keeping a pulse on what's going on in the wine world and checking the listings and so on and so forth. But now the day opens, I get up, I eat breakfast, I open my computer and kind of see what the fund needs. So I'm obviously implicated at a lot of different levels, offering a lot of oversight, helping people dispatch and manage and things like that. So it's really very different even in that capacity every day.
Yeah. Do you find it satisfying in the same way?
Very different. It's like fascinating to find how to like find fulfillment in this. It's been very gratifying work, and I'm definitely like a bit of a card carrying lefty when it comes to politics. So I always
let's talk about that.
Yeah, we can go into that as much as you'd like. But I always found it kind of interesting to bridge that gap. And it was always a discord I felt in my working practice, of that discord between worker and owner, or worker and patron, or all of the dynamics of capitalism that are kind of really fraught in restaurant work. So it's been kind of exciting to bridge that theoretical gap through action that feels really relevant and very direct in my community.
Okay. Does that go back to what you studied in school? Because when I told you about this podcast initially, I said that I used to do a radio show at CKUT at McGill, and we had a CKUT connection. You did an internship there, a little bit of everything you said, and then you worked at the Ottawa student radio station. So I'm wondering if your background in kind of cultural studies and communications at McGill kind of inspires what you're doing now. Does this particular element of your job feel more like a throwback to that than, say, your wine sommelier education at the ETHQ?
I mean, I would definitely say that's pretty bang on. That really resonates with me. I find all of that kind of theoretical groundwork I had in that institution, and learning about, different things like queer theory and art and film and decolonial or non-colonial practices and things like that have always been things in my personal life that I've read about and really have kept me thriving and interested and engaged politically. So it's very fascinating, kind of go back to my roots in that certain sense.
Yeah. And how are you finding now? I mean, you're not working in the same office as different people. Do you find the kinds of connections that you can create similar? Do you find, is it easier to find that kind of satisfaction in what you're doing now, despite the distance?
Well, it's really fascinating, actually. The group that we're, I'd say, like a rough baker's dozen in like the really kind of day-to-day nitty-gritty work of the fund. That being said, on and off, I think when I checked our Slack just before I came on with you, we've been 40 people on and off working on this. So it's really interesting. All volunteer, no one's paid. So very fascinating to see the people that have come out of the woodwork in my community that I've seen have, secretly had the same views as me, or we've had a similarity, or just interested in this cause. So it's really been fascinating to get to know people through the lens of this. And I feel like I've made really gratifying and like interesting things that have now relationships that are now turned into like really potent friendships. And so it's really great to see either folks I knew before and I'm kind of getting another side of, folks I didn't know, both within restaurants or just people who care about restaurants. So it's really been very collective and very interesting coming together of folks.
And just one more question about the fund, and then I will move on to more wine related things. But I'm really curious because I know that there have been a lot of larger donors contributing, and a lot of organizations that want to partner with you, and that have partnered with you. And I know that, for instance, Elena they were putting a lot of their cookbook that they created towards the fund, and I think they raised over $10,000, maybe way more than that by now. And initially it was over 10,000. Yeah, it's probably and they sold those really amazing t-shirts with Remember Skin Contact. If you haven't seen those, I really so cute one of those t-shirts. So I'm just wondering how what was the percentage of large donors versus individuals giving $25 or $10 or whatever?
I'd actually, now that you pose that question, I'd be very curious to actually know the statistics on that. We have had a few large donors here and there, but what's been really interesting about the coalescing of the partnerships is it's folks, I mean, our industry, food, wine, particularly, we've had a really strong showing from the wine community. We do, not only myself, have a few other sommeliers in the group. So I think that's why we've had a really great kind of repertoire there. But I mean, what I've been saying to folks is like, it's fantastic that people are able to amass larger donations, but we're equally as enthusiastic about small quantities. I think what's really fascinating about this project is we've literally had people who've gone on GoFundMe and been like, hey, this is like the $40 I can spare right now. Like, I just want to give you a hand. And I think that's like very honorable, very lovely showing. And to me, that deserves as much respect as kind of these larger donors, even though they go a little bit further. It's just really interesting and lovely to see everybody mobilizing according to their means.
That's amazing. And the website for that is
mtlrestorelief.fund.org.
Yeah, mtlrestorelieffund.org. And I'll put up the link to that in the show notes, wherever you download this podcast. We're now on iTunes and Stitcher and Spotify, and you can also watch it on Vimeo. So there are lots of places you can get it.
Very cool.
So I want to know exactly how you got into restaurants then. I know you're staying with your family right now. You come from a restaurant family. Can you just walk me through the path?
So my mom owns a restaurant out here, and it was like the summer job since forever, since I can walk pretty much. And I did the classic thing when I became a teenager and totally rejected that and was like, no way, I'm going to become a journalist and I'm going to McGill and all these stuff.
Bad call on the journalism. Just gonna say, hard times right now too.
Yeah, exactly. I was doomed to be in a precarious industry, it must seem. And so then after that, I went to McGill when I was about, I don't know, 18 or 19 years old. Did the motions there, got my degree. And then I was interested in working in restaurants again, just for a little bit of extra cash, but really didn't want to do traditional table service. I was kind of feeling a little bit tired of that already, in the dynamics ingrained in that. So that's when I linked up with the guys from Grumman 78, and this was prior to them having a restaurant. So it was when it was Hillary and Gail and their partner, who's no longer part of the group, Marc-André Leclerc, had just opened. So they had the truck and they had the event space. And so I worked there as kind of a summer gig, and then just kind of grew through the company as they opened the restaurant. I kind of climbed the ranks quite quickly. So I was general managing there, was in the company for about 4 years, and was the general manager there towards the end of my tenure for about the last year and a half. And that was where I was really lucky to meet a sommelier called Charles Tarzy, who's one of my best friends. Charles is amazing. It was his first gig as a somm, and he was the one who really opened my eyes. I had all of my formative moments with natural wines or things like that are really from him. So I have a lot of credit to give to him. And then towards the end of my time there, I did my school at the ETHQ. Then I worked at Vin Papillon and in the Joe Beef Gang. And then I left there to travel to Australia to do some wine things, and then ended up, at that time, Foxy was just opening up. The chef, her name is Lee Roper, and she used to be the chef of Vin Papillon. She's actually, ironically, she was one of my full circle moment first friends I met when I came to Montreal, back in those McGill days. And they were looking to hire a somm, and that's how I started there. I started managing the wine portfolio when it was just the 2 restaurants, and then as the company grew, I grew with them.
That's amazing. It seems like such a good company to be with, because they have expanded, and then they even have their place in the food hall, which is unfortunately closed. That would be really interesting to know what's going to happen there. I'll have to ask Diane Solomon at some point in the future, because
I'm very curious as well. So please let me know.
For sure. And so actually, what do you think is going to happen when restaurants open again? Obviously, you're not on the line with the government every day, but what are people in the industry saying right now?
I mean, I'm very curious. I anticipate before proper opening, like dining rooms being opening, it being quite a long time. I really don't see it happening. Personally, I don't imagine it happening before the fall. That being said, I have no idea. Like, it's this almost like very dystopian gaze of like, I can't imagine serving a table with like plastic walls between everyone and me wearing like a full kind of like hazmat suit situation. So
how can you enjoy the experience like that, you know?
Well, and even how do I do my job? Like, how do I taste? How do I keep, like, that throws it all out the door. So I'm very curious to see what that looks like. But I mean, on the positive side, I think it's a really interesting way to maybe rethink the wheel, and people have come up with like fantastic adaptive strategies, takeouts, little bottle shops, things like that. So I'm very curious, but I don't anticipate I'll be on the floor for a very long time.
Fair enough. So then wine has nothing to do with your job description right now. How do you feel about leaving that aside?
I'm okay with it, honestly. I've been really nurturing other kind of sides of my wine persona. I've been doing some little, master classes online and things like that. So I did a really interesting talk the other day with a lovely sommelier that we did a pop-up with at Foxy right before we closed down. Her name's Pascaline Lepelletier. She's a really well-known somm in the industry. Fantastic female mentor that I really look up to, and I was very lucky to meet her. So she just did a little talk on Austrian wines, tuned into that. Just kind of keeping it open and dynamic, and trying not to put too much pressure to like learn too much and like get into the theoretical aspect of it, but definitely keeping the fires burning, so to speak.
Fair enough. And what about wine producers at this time? Are they hit hard?
I'm very curious to see what the repercussions are going to be for producers, because I know Quebec as a whole is consuming quite a bit, which is great. And especially with laws relaxing around mixed cases and things like that, there's been quite a dynamic wine buying scene in Montreal, in Quebec generally. I think the SAQ is doing some like record numbers. I don't have any firm stats to back that up, but I've heard that they're just doing very, very well. So it's good. People are imbibing to, keep the joy up probably. But I'm very curious because I think it'll be a bit of a wave effect. I think for now there's things still being let in, but I mean, don't necessarily quote me on this, but I feel like in the future they're thinking about stopping export. So I think that might create some reverberation depending on how this crisis kind of manifests, but I know they're not thinking about shipping new things in. So I mean, we'll see. I think on the producer end, you'll feel that a little bit more on the other side, but it also is on the flip side of that for people like Quebec producers. It's been working out really fantastically. Like I just saw one of my favorite wineries, Pervenche, put out their new vintage and it's going super well and everyone's thirsty for it. So, I mean, I'm curious to see how they'll balance that out, but I imagine if there's the business behind it, SAQ will find a way to get us the wine and hopefully support our producers.
It would be the producer's decision to not export? And why would they decide to not export?
I feel like from what I've heard around this subject is it has to do with not the producers, it's really countries exporting goods at the moment. So I know for a brief period, I don't know if it's still the case, but France had shut down its ports and things like that. So I think...
Seems like cutting off your own foot a bit. Like you want that money from export unless they can sell everything locally.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine so too. And I think there was something to do with the SAQ not taking on any more until they saw kind of how this all panned out and things like that. So I imagine it's going to be a quite fluid situation as well.
Okay. So you mentioned mixed cases. Yeah, hopefully. You mentioned mixed cases, and that's a new option for Quebec consumers. What do you think personally is the best option for people who want to buy wine right now in Quebec or in the rest of Canada? I know everywhere's different.
I mean, I think the mixed cases thing is super fun. I think it's really dynamic and I'm very excited about it because it's been, 10 years that we've been lobbying for these slight bends of the rules in order to keep the scene a little bit more interesting. So I'm all for it. I think it's really fascinating way to also expose people to more of a variety. And I think there's a really dynamic, from what I've talked to from my wine importer friends, there's a really dynamic scene around private importation right now. And I think that's really cool in terms of it's opened the door for people who didn't know that was an option even before. They're like, oh, I can order a case of my favorite stuff, whether it be mixed or not. So I think that's a real positive side, that maybe there might be a stronger contact between individual consumer and importer.
Right. And for anybody who's listening right now or watching and doesn't understand exactly what we're talking about, we have private import companies that bring in cases directly from producers via the SAQ, via the liquor store. And it works a little differently in every province, but you can also buy directly from them as an individual. And before, they were only allowed to sell by the case, which was usually 12 bottles. And they weren't allowed to sell a mixed case. And it would always have to be picked up at the SRQ by the consumer. So there were a couple variables that made it a little bit more tricky for an individual to purchase that way. But they're often very interesting bottles. Before, natural bottles were allowed. If you were a natural wine drinker, you had to either buy at restaurants or through private importers. So there's been a lot of change in the industry in recent years. And so I'm wondering where you will be buying cases from for yourself personally in the future. Have you bought one yet?
So I indulge, despite my very limited budget at the moment, in two things. A bunch of us from the fund bought actually, and it's funny to admit this, but we bought this fantastic boxed wine from an agency called Centoventi, which was really interesting. They're doing 10% of their sales back to the fund, and they're doing a white, a rosé, and a red wine that's all boxed, all organic, really well made. I ran that same wine, the equivalent, exactly the same vintage and stuff, just in bottles at the restaurant. And it was a really killer deal. It was 3 liters for $60. And so for somebody like me who doesn't drink much, it's very ma tante and kind of granny, but it's very nice to have a little box that you can just seal and it doesn't go bad.
Yeah.
So I bought that, and I also indulged in the recent case that Onapol released. They're doing their panaches every Thursday, releasing new ones and kind of keeping them secret until the last minute. So it's quite exciting about that. And they did a panache of whites, which I'm obviously splitting with friends because in this time I don't have the funds nor the liver to absorb 12 bottles at once.
Yeah, these are often $300 to $600 12 bottle cases. Like they'll have a couple options. All of these agencies, basically, I think that's how it works. Well, they'll have like 3 or 4 maybe options where they choose what goes in the case. So you don't get to choose just from their entire repertoire. So what was in this particular case of whites?
So there was 4 wines. There was a Riesling from Les Pirouettes, which is a fantastic, I'd say like semi-négoce / apprenticeship program that Christian Binard does in Alsace. So he's a really well-reputed winemaker who actually coaches people who would like to move more into organics and biodynamics and natural winemaking. And so he kind of does a vineyard takeover with them and stewards them forward. And then they make wine under this label. There was an Aligoté, I believe, from Nicolas Vautier in Burgundy. There was, I'm missing one. There was a Le Petit Chemin from Benoît Courreau, which is one of my favorite Chenin Blanc. That was like the real winner for me. Really fantastic winemaker out of Anjou, making Chenins in a dry style. And then the last one was, what was it? Oh, it was Le Croix Morceau. So fantastic, very dry, very salty Muscadet from the Loire. So really exciting for spring and for all of like the shellfish and the crab and all of this stuff that's coming out right now. It's like the perfect pairing. So, and it really worked for my budget too. The bottles came up just north of $30. So it was still quite reasonable, even though I am sharing with friends. So that was one of them that spoke to me.
Okay. And so I know that usually wine markups in restaurants are around maybe 3 times the retail price, but there's a lot of restaurants selling a lot cheaper than that right now. And when you go to the importers directly, you're not paying that markup at all. But I'm wondering specifically about this other way of buying wine, which is often buying a bottle with takeout from a restaurant, which encourages the restaurant. They're actually probably staying afloat more from selling wine and beer than they are from selling actual food, which is often dirt cheap. So I'm wondering kind of about the ethics of that. Like as a sommelier who obviously loves this wine, what do you think about restaurants selling at a lower price just to kind of make ends meet?
I mean, I think I kind of have 2 minds of it. I think it's great. I think it's good that people are finding a way to stay afloat. From what I've seen, at least in the restaurants that I frequent and that I love, no one's being exorbitant at all or abusive with their markups. Everyone's being super reasonable given the circumstance. And I think what's interesting with that model is you can buy that one bottle that you would like. Perhaps a lot of restaurants have some real gems on their list right now. So it's a great opportunity to get that one little bottle you would like, even if it's, the markup ends up being like a $10 more markup. I know that seems like totally fair to me. So I'm all for it. I think it's interesting in terms of seeing the optics of it. And I think a lot of particuliers, now that they see the real quote unquote price of wines, there might be a little bit of a discord there, but I think generally speaking, from what I've seen, people are understanding that markups are normal in a restaurant setting, and that's the way that these places are going to stay afloat. So I don't think there's been any pushback around that. And I also think that, like I said earlier, no one's being crazy on the markups. Everyone's being very, very reasonable, just to kind of give them a little boost in these hard times.
What do you think about really high-end restaurants that have like a very deep cellar, especially at the beginning of this? I know now restaurants are even buying more wine and selling more wine, so maybe they're not selling off their most expensive bottles at a ridiculous discount. But at the beginning, there was a feeling of, okay, we just really need to get through this, and we're desperate. And there were great deals. So were there a lot of wine buyers and kind of people who would cellar wine and really take advantage of the situation? Like, did you ever feel like, oh gosh, like this anxiety about restaurants losing these amazing bottles at an unfair price just because they were desperate?
I mean, I think I have again, like, I think that everyone did what was necessary.
Yeah.
There was a little part of me that was like, "Ooh, that one's a tough one." I'm seeing some of those really special things, as particularly when we negotiate allocations or things like that. And more, I think what made me a little more uncomfortable is the optics of it. I'm not generally a som who like puts flashy things on Instagram, or I don't Instagram at all of the unicorns that we have in our cellar at Foxy or things like that. So I think there was a bit of like a trophy hunting kind of experience where a lot of folks were like just pinpointing the same bottles, and I kept seeing the same things kind of pop up, which I think is I think it's, on the one hand, I think it's great that people want to share their experience around wine, but on the other hand, it seems somewhat opportunistic. But I mean, that being said, the restaurants consent to sell them, so I think if you're buying them, it's great that you're encouraging a local spot.
Yeah, that's true. And especially it will be local if all we're getting is Quebec or Ontario or Canadian wine. It would be actually pretty amazing if we got a lot more BC wine and even Ontario wine. So how do you feel about doing a little bit of a lightning round?
Go for it.
Okay, so don't think about it really hard. Just answer whatever comes to your mind. What's the best wine you ever drank?
Ooh, the best wine I ever drank in recent memory, when Pascaline was in town, and I sound very name droppy with her, but we opened a 2012 Auvernois, which was absolutely fantastic.
Oof. What was it exactly?
So Pierre Auvernois is like a very, very celebrated winemaker in the Arbois region. He's kind of like the granddaddy of natural winemaking, and his wines are quite rare, very hard to come by. I had cellared a lot of old vintages at Foxy, so when she came to town, we opened one of those older vintages, so it was like a treat, a once in a lifetime kind of thing. So it was very delicious, even though it was drank quite late in the evening. I remember it very clearly.
What did it taste like?
I mean, Auvernois has this fantastic style of being, they're wines that are very precise, despite him kind of being this natural wine evangelist, and he was very much before his time. I don't know what age he is, but I wouldn't be surprised if he's well into his 80s. So he was really one of the forefathers of that kind of movement. So these wines are always precise. They're great kind of wines or in this houillé style in the Jura, which means topped up barrels. So they make oxidative wines, which are very salty and savory, but this was done in a more Burgundy style. So it'd be a great step left for folks who want to try something out of that Burgundy terroir in a similar vein. So has this kind of great backbone of like, almost like ripe orchard fruit and a minerality, but a plushness at the same time. It's a little bit different soil composition in Arbois versus Burgundy, so they have a little bit more texture depending on the area.
Do you remember exactly what it was, if I were to look up the bottle, or you just remember the experience?
Oh yeah, it was the 2012 Auvernois Chardonnay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. That's exciting. I love those kinds of experiences when you associate, even when it's not so much about like the nose and the flavor, it can be about tasting it with that particular sommelier, or could be tasting it with that group of people, which is something we don't get right now in COVID-19. So I'm just kind of wondering, I've kind of put aside the lightning round for a second because I got distracted with this question.
Go for it.
But what are your experiences now with eating and pleasure and dining? How has that changed, or has it been enhanced by being with your family or with whoever you're living with right now?
It's very different. So it's actually just me and my mom here. So it's a totally different dynamic. I mean, the one thing I would say around wine for me that's really a big part of it is sharing. And mostly like my favorite setting for wine kind of night would be with a few friends, maybe 4 or 5, and there's a boisterous dinner table and we're able to order 4 or 5 bottles and have smaller glasses, but try more. That's really dynamic. So I miss that kind of cathartic element and that part of wine, which is really exciting to me, of communion and breaking bread and so on and so forth. So that's totally different. I mean, that being said, I'm like lots of folks and really able to like fall back into my body and think about my rhythms and think about what makes me feel good in a really embodied way, which often in restaurants you kind of put aside because you're in the rush and you're eating a sandwich at midnight over a garbage can or things like that. So being a little bit more conscious of what my body's saying, what it's showing up, what it's needing in terms of food and drink is really nice.
Okay, let's segue back to the lightning round with that.
Hit me. I'm ready.
What was the last delicious meal you had?
The last delicious meal I had the other day, my mom, we're Polish, so my mom we had some pierogies, and we have a bunch of ramps in the backyard, so I fried them up on top with some sour cream. Delicious.
Would you rather cook or eat?
Eat.
Red, white, orange, or rosé?
White.
Sweet or salty?
Ooh, I'm like a big salty sweet person, but I think I'd go sweet.
What's your COVID-19 comfort food?
Ooh, I'm really enjoying like kid snacks. Like I always make this like very childish plate of like crackers and cheese, which I'm like loving. Like very like 1992 with like some cut up apples.
Are we talking like cheese slices or like legit like
legit cheese,
cheddar?
Nothing crazy expensive, but I mean I'm out here in the sticks, so I don't have really access to the fancy cheeses, but you know the old Balderson cheddars come in pretty clutch sometimes.
Okay. Worst meal you've had since this all started?
Worst meal, I don't think I've had any necessarily bad food, but I've had worst meals in terms of like my mental state. So when I'm like really feeling the pressure around this, or I'm not able to enjoy it, or I'm just not able to connect with it, that would be kind of the worst for me.
Okay. I'll accept that. It's not specific, but it's acceptable.
It's more esoteric. Yeah.
Describe your wine philosophy or beer philosophy as you take a sip of beer in 3 words.
Wow, that's a tough one. I would say natural and all of that term that encompasses, but what that means for me. Local, not necessarily from here, but really representing. And I would say authentic.
Oh, I like that. What does authentic mean to you?
I just, I guess that kind of would be like a subcategory of the natural, but I find that it's really winemakers or beer makers or whatever it may be who really have a vision and a point of view and are trying to represent that either through the terroir, through their philosophies in relationship to the land, wines that are just also not really full of makeup. So that goes back to kind of the natural side of it. Wines that are very authentic, very real, very grounded.
Okay. Do you have a bottle set aside for when this is over to celebrate?
I have a few bottles. When I came up here, I left all of my champagne collection, and I love champagne at home. So I have an older vintage of Jacques Lassagne hanging out, and that I will definitely drink when all this is over.
Have you ordered any cases from private wine importers besides Onopole? That was the only one you said?
Yeah, Onopole was the only one. Yeah, that's the only thing. I brought up a little thing that I did a little tour of my local SAQ, which fortunately has some fun things. Thank you to people like Onopole, and shout out to Raisin and all those guys that are making that possible.
Okay. I often ask the question about a desert island meal in kind of in a podcast, in a lightning round anyway. So what's your COVID-19 kind of desert island meal? What would be your dream?
Right now, I am very much missing some very close friends of mine own a restaurant in Montreal called Alma.
Oh, the Spanish wine bar.
Yeah, precisely. And that would be a meal cooked by Juan would be my desert island meal right now. Just all of the menu there.
Whatever he would give you, it would just come.
I'd take it all the salty, fishy things, I'm in.
Hopefully they get back on their feet when this is all said and done. Okay, so that ends the lightning round. You did very well.
Thank you. I pressed up against the boundaries, but it's okay.
I know you've gotten a lot of media attention for the fund, and I know there was initially some trouble with feeding out the money through GoFundMe. A lot of fundraisers had that problem internationally. It was a bit of a nightmare. And I mean, they got swamped because everybody was using GoFundMe. To be fair, I don't want to speak badly about GoFundMe. Obviously, they're supporting amazing initiatives and doing their best. But how would you do this differently if you had to do it all again, whether that's related to GoFundMe or not? I mean specifically the Montreal Restaurant Emergency Relief Fund.
I think if I really zoomed out, I would have started something like this 6 months ago so that we would be better prepared for this. But that being said, I honestly don't have many, like, all of our, and this seems very like a bit kumbaya of me, but like all of our missteps really ended up teaching us things. So using GoFundMe, even though it took longer, was very practical while we got the nonprofit set up, while we got our bank account set up. So all of the learning curves that we've had, and we're very fortunate to be, like I said, a large team that offers a lot of oversights from a lot of different industries. We have folks who are in law, we have folks that are in nonprofits, we have restaurant workers, we have folks who work in PR, we have graphic designers, things like that. So it's able to offer that really global oversight. So I don't think we've had any major missteps, and anything that we have kind of faced as an obstacle, it's just been an opportunity to learn and adapt.
Okay. Do you think that COVID-19 will create waves in the wine world long term? You mentioned one thing when we were speaking the other day, and this is just to give you the background from where my thought process of the question comes from. You talked about a vintage being devalued. What do you see? Do you think that will happen, and what do you think the ramifications of that are?
I don't know. I honestly pose that more as like almost like an open question. Like, I'm very curious, and I've discussed this with lots of my wine friends of like, are these current wines that are coming out that people are buying at a discount going to be like the COVID wines? Is there a way to like track that? Because we have such different markets, US versus Canada, like Quebec versus Ontario, whatever. So I'm very curious to see kind of what that means. And then in terms of more employment, I have no idea what it means for the wine world. Like, I'm very, very curious to see what jobs are available after this. I think there'll be a lot of also people that kind of, come out of the ashes and come up with new concepts, and there's always room for growth and room to kind of rethink the wheel, so to speak. So yeah. I'm embracing the curiosity of it, but I have no clue.
It just makes me think personally, when you think about like big companies, like the kind of the bigger commercial, less expensive go-to wines of the majority of the population. I'm not talking natural, I'm not talking small producer, artisanal, natural, whatever, but the places that need a lot of workers to pick fruit, to apply pesticides, to tend the vines. And if those are seasonal workers, and we're seeing issues with that, and they're living together in small areas, and then you'll have to put more money into housing, more money into social distancing, and then the price of wine goes up. Do you think there'll be a lowered interest in wine if prices are kind of across the board, especially in what is now very affordable wine, go up?
I hadn't thought about that. That's a very interesting point. I think wine prices in the last few years have increased quite a bit, particularly when you are working with smaller producers, just because a lot of the areas that we work with, because of the effects of climate change and so on and so forth, have been really affected. So, like Burgundy, for example, has like had catastrophe after catastrophe of like frost, hail. So it's been really hard to get vintages up and running. So I'm very curious, and the prices have jumped as a result because there's less fruit, less ability to create volume, and so on and so forth, more kind of scarcity. So I'm very curious seeing going forward what that means for the wine. Maybe we'll have like a banger vintage, and maybe like they'll work it out. I myself am particularly interested in seeing if there's any Quebecers that need work in the field, and that's something if I can do a little stage helping out in the vines. That's something I would personally, obviously unpaid, but that's something I would love to do, just to maybe give those winemakers a hand, because I think even locally there are a ton of people I really believe in. So it'll be a great opportunity.
If people do want to check out local, you mentioned Les Pervenches. Are there other wineries that either deliver or they can get at the SAQ? Or otherwise,
there's tons of really fantastic projects in Quebec coming up. So Les Pervenches is fantastic, really excellent biodynamic project in Farnham. They are my personal coup de cœur for Quebec. They really shaped, just more so because they made those kind of formative bottles that I remember tasting, was like, wow, we have fantastic terroir here. Like this is the possibility. It blew my mind. Domaine Nival, who also just released their cider project. In terms of cider, Quebec is super, super dynamic. So there's Les Polissons, there's this new project called Turbulence, which I've been looking after, Nival, tons of smaller cideries and beer brasserie and things like that. Even I have a very dear friend who works at Damas. He's the sommelier there. His name's Guillaume La Liberté, and him and a few friends have started a little négoce project in Quebec called Les Vins Via. So I think we're going to see really exciting things when we're kind of forced to turn our gaze locally. And it's been really exciting. I know so far there's been, just talking to my friends who have little boutiques or little dépanneurs that do sell local things, there's been like a huge uptick. So you think of people like the folks at the Butter Bloom, who have a fantastic selection of local wines and beers, Comptoir Saint-Cécile, doing super well. And I think it's exciting. I think it's a great way to kind of diversify.
I love that you see the optimistic side of that, the glass half full rather than half empty.
As I take a big swig of beer.
Beer. Yeah, mine will be fine. I'll just drink beer. And cider. No, there is definitely a silver lining. You just have to look forward in terms of job pivots, in terms of what we're drinking, in terms of what the government can provide, and even markets where we realize it's not sustainable, like restaurants industry having tiny margins. Maybe there'll be something to learn there. So I just wanted to ask just one more question, just in general, because you're working with the fund, I'm wondering if the government subsidies are enough in your opinion.
I know for me personally, just obviously it's a drastic pay cut compared to what I was making earlier. So I can only kind of speak from personal experience. I'm fine. Like my subsidies cover my kind of like break even, if you will, for like not having to radically change my life, meaning like sell my car or move to a less expensive, even though I live in, I'm lucky, I have a very affordable apartment, but things like that. So I don't know, honestly, like, and I'm very lucky in terms of, I don't have any dependents. I don't have any serious, I'm an able-bodied person. So there's lots of kind of things that mediate my experience. But I mean, I think we're, generally speaking, when I think about government subsidies, it can always be improved. And that's not what I'm trying to say necessarily, that the system is perfect. But when I see a lot of my friends, particularly in New York City or in the States and what they're going through, I'm very grateful for our system.
Well, thank you, Canada.
Yeah, exactly. Shout out to Justin Trudeau.
Yeah. And thanks so much, Kaitlin. Cheers to you. I appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
It'd be great to touch base again in 6 months and see what happens.
Whenever you would like.
Perfect. Thanks for watching and listening to the 5 à 7 podcast. If you're wondering why I had to change my sweater to do an outro, I made tomato sauce between when the video file was completing and right now. And of course, I spilled it all over my shirt. So I decided to support local in terms of where I'm from. This is a free Newfoundland sweatshirt that I've had since I was about 18, which is a lot of years. And I think that you should support whatever local is for you. So if you happen to be in St. John's and you can support Living Planet where I got this sweater, please do so. I ordered some sushi for my mom on the weekend. You can also do that for other people because she hadn't had sushi in a really, really long time and she's a little bit of an addict. And Mother's Day is coming up, and by the time you see this, Mother's Day will have passed. So Father's Day is coming up, and I'm sure your dad or you perhaps, if you are a father, would love something delicious too. If you want recommendations for that, come back to the 5 à 7 podcast next week. We'll be here every week. I'll be here with somebody else, not literally physically with somebody else, but I'll be talking with somebody else, hopefully someone that you also find fascinating, and drinking something delicious for a little happy hour. So hope you join us again.